Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. Many writers believe because they have written novels or written screenplays that they can write comic books. And what they don't understand is that the medium of comic books is completely different than the novel, and it is completely different than the screenplay. And one has to learn how to master the craft of writing a comic book in the same way they would master the craft of writing a novel or the craft of writing a screenplay. Now, when it comes down to comic books, they have their own format for writing. And the reason why comic books have their own format for writing is because they are a visual medium. And comic books tell their story in a visual medium completely different than that of a novel or that of a screenplay. Now, when a person is writing a novel, they are using the words to make pictures in people's minds. And usually those pictures are moving in the imagination of the individual in the novel as they read the prose. Now, in screenwriting, people are also trying to make pictures in people's minds with their words. However, the screenwriter is using the fewest economy of words. They're using very minimal amounts of words to create pictures in people's minds. Not only to create that image, but to make that image move as the person reads the screenplay and as the director and the producers create the visual imagery for the film. Now, the comic book is different than both of those formats for storytelling because the comic book tells its story in pictures. And these are static pictures. So a comic book writer has to create a single image per panel that tells a portion of the story. And in that single panel, they not only have to create a dynamic image in the mind of the artist that they can interpret, but they also have to make that image so dynamic that is in the mind of the artist so that when they draw it, it appears to be dynamic and moving. And it has to move in such a way that the reader, when they see these images, take their eyes and move from panel to panel. Because when people read comic books, they look at the panels and they follow the action with their eyes. And a writer has to be able to write action in each panel that ensures that the reader's eyes move from panel to panel so that they can follow the story. And this is why comic book writing is extremely different than that of a novel or a screenplay. And if you don't understand how comic book writing works as a craft, you're going to have a hard time being able to make sure that your readers understand what you're showing in your story. Because in a comic book, you have to do the most amount of showing in your story. Now, in novels, you have to show with the words that you use in prose, and in screenplays, you have to show with the words you use, as few as they are. But in a comic book, you have to be able to create an incredibly powerful single visual image with each panel, and each panel has to be strong enough that it moves the reader's eyes from panel to panel. And it's a very tricky medium to work in, and you have to really know what you're doing when you're out here writing comics. Because if the reader's eyes don't move from panel to panel and the action doesn't move from panel to panel, then the reader's not going to continue reading the comic book. And this is something many writers think they can do, but it's a real challenge to do because you have to ensure that that panel moves from frame to frame and moves the reader's eyes from panel to panel so that the action flows throughout that comic book. And this is one of the key words in writing comic books. Comic books are all about action because It's the actions that characters participate in that gets the reader's attention in that picture. You cannot have static pictures of people in a comic book. That's just not going to work if you're going to move the story along. If you have a story, the action has to be moving continuously. We need to be focused on that main character from what is called the splash page, because the splash page is the first page of the comic book, and the splash page is where we see who the main character is, what they want to do, and why we should care enough to turn the next page and start reading the story. That's what the importance of the splash page is. The splash page is the reader's introduction to the character. They're the introduction to the action. They're the introduction to the conflict, and they are the core main reason why the person will feel compelled to keep reading the story. A lot of people, they go into comics thinking they can put prose on the first page, but if you put prose on the first page, you're not going to have the impact on the reader. You really want them to focus on the picture, and then as they look at the picture and the picture catches their eyes, they will read whatever prose you have in a caption or a thought bubble or a balloon, and they will read that, and then that's going to grab them and make them start turning pages. And this is something people just don't understand. A lot of people who write novels or YA novels or any other sort of medium understand about the comic book, and they also don't understand that when it comes down to comic books, the pacing is a lot faster than a novel, and it is a lot faster than a screenplay, because comic books have to move very quickly because they only have 20 pages in most cases to tell their story. And when you're selling comic books, you have to tell the most amount of story in the fewest amount of pages. And it's very different than screenwriting, where you have to tell the most amount of story with the fewest amount of words, because in screenwriting, you only have a handful of sentences, you only have like one or two sentences to establish a scene, the main characters, and then you have to establish your conflict in less than 10 pages. But in a comic book, you have to establish that conflict within less than 3 to 5 pages, because you have only maybe 20 or 22 pages to complete this portion of the story. And this is what makes comic books a challenge to work in, because a comic book, you have to really, the pace is a lot faster. You're in a visual medium, and you have to tell your story very quickly and in a very condensed format. And a lot of people, again, they come into comics from things like YA novels, where you have almost limitless space, because a novel is 50,000 words and it's all prose. So you can come in with a novel, and you can come in with 50,000 words, and you can tell your story there. But that type of storytelling doesn't work in comics. When you try to use a novel approach to comics, you're going to have a very slow story. And when you try to use a screenwriting approach to comics, you're going to have a comic book that it has visuals, but the whole thing is there's going to have pacing problems, and you're going to have dialogue issues, because dialogue works differently than it does in a movie than it does a comic book. And this is something a lot of screenwriters have a hard time dealing with, because you can have characters go into this long diatribe in a screenplay, but in a comic you have to condense the dialogue so that it continues to keep the story moving. This is something, again, it's a challenge to work in, because it's a completely different writing medium, and you have to understand the mechanics of how that writing medium works before you start writing stories in it. Because comic books, again, they tell the most amount of story in the fewest amount of pages, and that's why they have to be fast paced. That's why they have to have a lot of action, and that's why the panels have to move. It's really everything is really condensed, and each panel has to tell a portion of the story to the point where it compels the reader to look at the next panel, and then look down at the next panel, and then at the next panel, and then the next panel, and then move up to the next panel. So you have to be able to tell your story with single solitary images that are dynamic enough to keep the reader moving, and to also be able to be done in such a way that the artist can interpret it so that the action moves from panel to panel. It's a major challenge to work in, and many people think, oh, because a person wrote a novel with a vivid imagery in it, they can write comics, but that's not the case. And some people think because a person wrote a screenplay, they can write a comic, but you have to understand that comic books are a different medium, and you have to learn how the skill set works for that medium if you hope to tell stories in that medium. One of the ways you can learn how to write comics is to start reading comic book scripts, and people who write good um, comic scripts are people like Chuck Dixon. I used to study a lot of his scripts, and I studied a couple of Kurt Busiek scripts so that I could understand how the comic book medium works. And I'm going to leave a link to one of my test scripts that I posted on my blog so that you can get a little bit of an understanding of how some of the comic scripts work, because comic book scripting, again, it's very completely different than the novel. It's completely different than the screenplay. And if you hope to make a very compelling comic, you have to understand how to write a story for that visual medium that enables you to create pictures in an artist's imagination so that they can be able to tell your story clearly and vividly to the reader, so that once they take a look at the comic, they can see all the action coming to life in those images, and those images literally will be moving in their imagination in the same way those images move in people's imaginations when they read a novel, or the same way they move when they are interpreted from a screenplay. You can check out my script for an ISIS series story on my blog by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my ISIS series stories, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.